two hallmarks of amateur video are poor lighting and shaky handheld shots. In this segment, we're going to handle the second of those two problems as we address the challenges of image stabilization. Of course, the one-word reply to that challenge is tripod, but there's a lot more to getting professional results than just 3 legs. From handheld electronic image stabilization to fluid heads and flying camera mounts, we're ready to get steady next on TechKnow. When you watch America's Funniest Home Videos or browse around YouTube, most of the original videos you'll see scream amateur. And while garbled audio swamped with camera noise and poor lighting are at least partially responsible, the one aspect of amateur video that is the easiest to correct is the shake of a handheld shot. A tripod is most often the solution, but some shooting styles require the mobility of handheld shots, so it's not always the only answer. In-camera image stabilization is a feature of almost all consumer camcorders and many professional cameras and lens systems. In-camera image stabilization comes in 2 varieties, electronic and optical. Electronic image stabilization, or EIS, is an image processing trick that relies on a slightly oversized image sensor. As the camera detects uniform movements across the image sensor, or CCD, the post-CCD processor corrects the position of the pixels in the frame and records a stabilized image to tape or whatever recording medium is being used. Depending on the image sensor's size and the amount of correction required, EIS can reduce the effective resolution of the image by as much as 40%. In most cases, the loss of resolution is not that high, however, and EIS is usually beneficial when shooting handheld. But it's also not a bad idea to turn it off when you're on a tripod. Optical image stabilization, or OIS, uses a lens element that is actuated by gyrometers to move the light entering the camera around so that it casts a steady image on the CCD. Optical image stabilization is superior to electronic image stabilization, but it is, of course, more expensive, and it also results in some reduction in resolution, perhaps only 10% or so. More expensive professional cameras and lenses with stabilization usually use optical image stabilization, while more affordable consumer cameras rely on electronic image stabilization. Besides the minor cost of reduced resolution, one of the problems with in-camera image stabilization systems is that they need to somehow magically distinguish between unintentional bumps that need to be corrected and intentional camera moves like pans and tilts. In some cases, the stabilization system erroneously corrects the beginning of a pan, freezing the image in place for a moment and then jumping to catch up with the current position of the pan. For this reason, you might want to turn image stabilization off when you have your camera on a tripod, and especially if you will be performing any camera moves. When given a choice, a tripod is always preferable to handheld. Yes, tripods are cumbersome, intrusive, take time to set up, and limit your mobility. There really isn't any substitute for what is essentially the most ancient piece of camera technology that's still around. Unless you're an on-call ENG shooter covering breaking news, there probably aren't too many excuses you can make for not using a tripod. There are a huge variety of tripods on the market, from $20 Superstore sticks all the way up to $20,000 Hollywood-class beasts and beyond. The most important part of a tripod is the head, which is usually responsible for most of the price. One of the most common and economical solutions is a fluid head video tripod. The fluid in the head actually resists movement and smooths out pans and tilts dramatically. Fluid heads start at about $50, but usually cost a good deal more than that, and that's just for the head. The other part of a tripod system is, of course, the legs. This is a much simpler discussion and isn't really very technical at all. I would recommend flip lever locks of some type, simply for security and convenience sake. You might also look for other convenience features like spreaders. Weight, durability, and rigidity or flexibility are also important considerations, as are special features that might let you get really low as well as very high. Altogether, I would expect to spend about $200 on a starter video tripod for today's small format consumer cameras and $1,000 or more for a serious professional system. $1,000 may seem like a lot of money to spend on what may not be the sexiest piece of video equipment you ever buy, but a good tripod system will likely outlast your current camcorder and your next camcorder, and probably the one after that. So it's definitely a worthwhile investment that you will not regret. The last camera stabilization technology I want to talk about today is the flying camera mount, the most famous example of which is the Steadicam. This is a very cool technology, but it's also a very special and expensive piece of gear that's definitely not appropriate for all situations. While a flying camera shot can add a certain cinematic look to some productions, it can look really weird and distracting in other situations. All counterbalanced flying camera supports work basically the same way. The camera is first mounted on a gimbal of some sort that gives it a very free range of movement. Hanging below the gimbal is a counterweight that actually does two things. First of all, as a counter to the camera, it balances the rig precisely on the gimbal. Second, it adds weight to the entire camera rig system, which as a whole resists movement simply because it's heavier. In essence, the principle is quite simple, but getting the balance exactly right is very tricky, and the precisely machined gimbal can be very expensive. In practice, shooting with a system like this requires, well, practice, and the entire rig is by design rather heavy, cumbersome, and tiring to use. As a result, flying camera supports come with accessories, which cost even more money, such as a special spring arm or a vest that supports the camera on the operator. A flying camera shot should, in most cases, be considered an effects shot, and is not really the same as image stabilization used to improve the fundamental quality of your video. And you will, realistically, use it sparingly and not for every shot. In any case, user skill is relevant to all of the stabilization technologies we've talked about here today. Practice your handheld techniques, zoom out as wide as you can, figure out when you need to turn your camera's image stabilization on and off, and learn the ins and outs of your tripod. As we often conclude on these TechKnow segments, it's not really about the technology, it's about how you use it.